Today, the 25th of October 2015, marks the 600th anniversary of one of the most famous battles in English history, Agincourt. The battle marked the climax of a campaign by King Henry V to reassert English control over her possessions in Normandy, which had been battered and diminished during the 100 Years' War. The campaign had been largely indecisive. In early August, the king had landed around 10,000 troops in northern France and marched on the town of Harfleur. A month-long siege ensued before the town's garrison capitulated on the 22nd of September. The delay caused by the siege had robbed Henry of the time he needed to effect a major attack on the French mainland, whilst disease and French resistance had lost him a third of his men. Honour demanded that King Henry not simply withdraw, however, and he embarked upon a traverse of the lands he was there to reclaim. On the 8th of October the army began to march, avoiding French forces on several occasions and effecting several difficult river crossings. But hunger and disease were wearing the army down, and even though the army force-marched over 250 miles in 16 days, they were not able to avoid the French entirely. On the 24th of October, Henry's scouts reported that the French had blocked his path, and near the village of Maisoncelles, he allowed his men to set down and rest, for the next day they would have no other choice but to fight. In the freezing early hours of the morning, the English soldiers ate their meagre breakfast, heard mass, and readied themselves for battle. The English line was formed at a natural bottleneck between two woods, and for 4 long hours they held there, facing the French force that is estimated to have numbered about 25,000 men. Eventually, Henry lost patience, and had his men move forwards to within extreme bow range of the enemy. After the first volleys of English arrows were loosed and impacted into the waiting lines of Frenchmen, they were provoked into charging. The mounted French knights thundered forwards, followed by the heavily armoured men-at-arms, but continuous English bow fire saw the mounted knights waver as their horses were maddened by pain and the deaths of their riders. Yet still the cavalry came on, reaching the lines of the English archers. But the Englishmen had placed before them sharpened wooden stakes, upon which the horses impacted at full gallop. The front rank was impaled by the improvised fortifications, with their riders thrown to the ground or crushed by their maddened steeds. The rest turned tail and ran. The fleeing horses crashed into the lines of pursuing infantry, maiming and crushing many of them. Nonetheless, the men-at-arms bravely continued their charge, disdaining to attack the archers, who at this point had resumed fire upon them, and instead plunging into the waiting lines of English footmen. The impact of the French charge pushed the English back a little, but so tightly packed were the French that they could not use their weapons effectively. Henry had positioned his men well, and the English were able to reap a heavy toll on the crushed French noblemen. The English archers at this point dropped their bows and fell upon the flanks of the French men-at-arms with their knives and mallets, picking particularly at those who had been over-encumbered by their heavy armour and lay helpless in the mud of the heavily ploughed battlefield. A short and bloody melee ensued, with the French second line arriving merely in time to join in the rout of those who began to flee from the front. The fighting was short but decidedly bloody, as the hemmed-in Frenchmen were unable to use their numbers or training to best advantage. Chronicles surely exaggerate the French losses, with accounts describing piles of bodies the height of a man, but regardless we can be sure that they were extreme. An improvised charge by the Duke of Brabant failed to dent the lines of the victorious English, unsupported as it was by the remaining French forces. But slightly later on in the day, it appeared to King Henry that the French third line was making ready to attack. At the same point, a body of French peasants levied by a couple of remaining knights set upon the English baggage park. In response to this, Henry gave his infamous order to execute the prisoners that he held, for fear that they would rise up and overwhelm some of his forces. This was a difficult decision to make, as every noble prisoner represented a considerable loss in potential ransom, and several knights refused to obey him, leading the order to be carried out by an esquire and a force of peasant archers. The killing of the prisoners was halted when it became clear that the remnants of the French army were in fact quitting the field, but only after many men had been killed. The English had won the day, outnumbered 3-1 by far superior forces. The next morning the army refreshed themselves, gathered their own wounded, finished off any remaining Frenchmen who were not worthy of ransom, and marched to Calais. On the 29th of October they arrived with over 2,000 prisoners, and Henry left for England at once to meet his hero's welcome.